Thank you, Mark, and a big hello from London. An interesting and eclectic mix of weekly patterns last week. Some connected and some so very much not. I'll start with the currencies. And last week we had a weekly key reversal up in euro sterling right at the top of the recent market. And we have had a nice follow through higher this week as well. This action was in its own way related to the weekly key reversal down we saw last week in cable, or sterling against the US dollar, which this week has seen attempts at a follow-on lower. And at this time, well, we have started to move lower than last week's close, though barely. We also had a weekly key reversal down last week in Kiwi dollar against the US dollar, and this likewise had a follow-on lower this week, though clearly better and more defined. Now, in the US dollar against the Korean won, we had a similar pro-dollar move with a weekly key reversal up last week, though it's only been until today that we've seen a move higher beyond the high of last week. Then we had a weekly key reversal up in US dollar against the Swedish krona and euro against the Swedish krona last week, and both these have not seen a follow-on move higher, with the market this week lower than Friday's close and prices staying within last week's range. This also applies to the Japanese yen against the Chinese yuan, which had a weekly key reversal down last week, but which has seen no real move lower this week, though prices are close to the lows of last week, if seemingly hesitating right now. Now, related to the moves in sterling and dollar, we had weekly key reversals down last week in both UK gilt futures and US bond futures. Both of these have seen none to limited attempts lower this week, such that I would regard there having been no follow-on moves lower. A similar situation can be applied to the more esoteric US dollar Nigerian Naira 1 month NDF, which had a weekly key reversal down last week, if only just. And this week has been trying down at the lows of last week, but not really been able to break any lower. Over now to the commodities, and we had an interesting pair of pairs. We had weekly key reversals down last week in both New York coffee futures and in London coffee futures. Both of these have so far failed to follow on lower, though prices are still hanging around last Friday's close on both. I covered these in greater depth in my weekly coffee video commentaries published this past Monday. We also had weekly key reversals down last week in the complementary New York and London sugar futures, and much like coffee, these have failed at following on lower, and indeed seem to have had a somewhat reactionary move back up very recently after first trying to follow on lower. However, these are still within last week's range, and I cover them more fully in my weekly sugar video commentaries, also published this past Monday. Finally, we had a weekly key reversal up in spot platinum prices last week, and these have seen an extraordinarily strong move higher this week, especially yesterday, such that we have made a new high and high close yesterday, one not seen since July 2014. As I say, a quite extraordinary and also quite satisfactory follow-on high to the previous week's pattern. As always, I'm happy to answer any direct questions with anyone who is interested. And with that, I'll finish this section from London, and I hope that you found these comments useful. Thank you for listening and watching this broadcast. This weekly broadcast gives the essential market patterns and consequences. Please be aware of the risk disclaimer posted both at the front and at the back of this broadcast. The copyright is Eddie Tofpick and ADM Investor Services International Limited. And here comes the final important bit.